Well, namaste everyone. It's always a pleasure to be present at a Dun and Bradstreet event. It's the first time I've come to this particular event on PSU and government. Mr. Gupta, maybe we should get that thing going. Why not? I caught a little bit towards the end of the earlier session on the public sector. Understandably, this being the kind of forum it is, there are very lot of references to the public sector, which is also understandable because public sector entities are going to get rewarded today. Let us cast our minds back about why the public sector was set up in the 1950s. It's familiar to all of you, but it's worthwhile refreshing our memories. There's an argument about market failure. The private sector would not be able to come in. There was an argument about the private sector then lacking the capital, lacking the technology. Hence, there was an argument that the public sector should come in and occupy the commanding heights. The question that all of us should ask, to what extent are those arguments about market failure and those arguments about the reluctance of the private sector to come in equally valid today? Are they valid arguments or are they not? The world of liberalization, and whenever we face liberalization, each one of us wears two hats. We wear a hat as a consumer, and we wear a hat as a producer or as an individual who is working in a public sector entity. As a consumer, we will never want a monopoly. If I were to ask all of you, would you like a situation where we have an Indian Airlines monopoly? Would you like a situation where you'd have to wait any number of years to get a landline connection? As a consumer, you would flatly refuse. The logic should be the same whether I am wearing my hat of a consumer or wearing my hat of a producer. The logic, therefore, is of competition. One of the principles of competition is free entry and free exit. When one is talking about PSUs, there are of course state-level PSUs, and there are also so-called central PSUs, and we are fundamentally talking about central PSUs here today. If you look at the number of central PSUs that exist today, and PSUs do not only mean the ones that are being rewarded and awarded here today, because the PSUs are a very heterogeneous basket. There are central level PSUs which have not published their annual reports and balance sheets for several years. So just because I'm looking at the tip of the iceberg, just because I am looking at elephants which are dancing, I should not presume that every elephant is capable of dancing. Half the PSUs that exist today were sick public sector enterprises that were not allowed to close down. The private versus public comparison is at one level a bit of a red herring. Because the private sector is also extremely heterogeneous, and it is not quite the case that the private sector necessarily covers itself with glory. The critical issue is not equity or ownership. The critical issue is whether the exit happens or not. The critical issue is whether the management has sufficient degrees of freedom to be independent. Since the 1980s, second half of the 1980s, we have experimented with making public sector entities functionally independent, independent of the ministries and the departments. It has not exactly been successful. When we look at a public sector entity, it is also important to distinguish between a commercial objective and a social objective. Social objectives, to my way of thinking, are best pursued through other means rather than using the disguise of what should be a commercial entity to drive social sector objectives. When we look at the success of a public sector enterprise or the failure of a public sector enterprise, we must also remember the opportunity costs of resources. The issue is not whether the profits are X%. The issue is what would have been the profit or the social rate of return or even the private rate of return had those resources been employed elsewhere. That is the critical question to ask. The critical question to ask is not whether the public sector is doing well today. But the critical question to ask is whether the public sector would have done well had the union government not poured in these resources. If public sector enterprises are so great, then they don't need union government's budgetary support. They should be able to survive on their own. Are they able to? I leave that for you to reflect on as a rhetorical question. When one is talking about profits, as a basic principle, one must also remember that profits are a meaningless term if I am talking about a monopoly. I must remember that profits are a meaningless term if there is administered pricing. So the question in a way to ask, and it is a counterfactual because we do not know the answer, is would the public sector have performed equally well had there been no monopoly? Had there been exposure to competition? Would the public sector have performed equally well in an environment where there is no administered pricing? Would the public sector have performed equally well when there wasn't union government budgetary support, including for capital investments. And if we ask this question, my apprehension is, remembering what I said about the public sector being a very heterogeneous basket, my apprehension is that the answer is not always going to be very palatable. The writing on the wall, as I said earlier, is one of competition. That writing on the wall has not gone away because we are in exceptional situations today. Post-COVID, all of you know that we have invested in public digital infrastructure. That is a clear case of increasing returns to scale rather than market failures and the private sector not having access to technology. To justify the existence of the public sector, I would have to establish increasing returns to scale, which is difficult to establish, or a market failure, which I don't think exists, or limited access to technology, which in this day and age, again, is really a non-issue. Congratulations to all those who have won awards. Congratulations are also in order for those who will win awards in a climate of greater competition. Thank you very much.